joining us. The president of Germany is currently on a 6-day state visit here in China. So what can we expect from such a visit? And with peace talks taking place over in Stockholm, Sweden, aimed at ending the civil war in Yemen, what can we realistically expect that to achieve? Welcome to The Point. I'm Michael Wong, sitting in for Liu Xin. Well, German President Frank-Walter Steinmeier is currently on a 6-day state visit to China at the invitation of Chinese President Xi Jinping. It is Mr. Steinmeier's first state visit to China since he took office back in March of 2017. And having started his visit in southeast China's Guangdong province, he is also scheduled to meet President Xi Jinping as well as Premier Li Keqiang. Now, China, of course, is already Germany's top trading partner with a volume of more than $204 billion in 2017. Putting it ahead of the United States for the second straight year. Now, more than half of Berlin's trade with Beijing is handled in the port city of Hamburg, where every third container in the port either arrives from China or is destined for it. Now, a total of more than 900 Chinese companies have branches over in Germany, including 550 such firms that are based in Hamburg. Now, during his talks with President Xi and Premier Li Keqiang, Mr. Steinmeier is expected to discuss bilateral ties, China-EU relations, as well as major international issues of common concern. So, what is the significance of Steinmeier's visit, given the already strong ties that China and Germany currently enjoy? I'm joined by Cui Hongjian, a senior research fellow and director of the Department for European Studies in the China Institute of International Studies. And from Brussels, we are joined by Mr. Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us here on The Point. Mr. Cui, I want to begin with you first because German public broadcaster Deutsche Welle has made no mention of this trip whatsoever on its website, while ZDF, also a public broadcaster, managed just one paragraph in its news coverage, simply saying that Mr. Steinmeier had arrived. Meanwhile, apart from reporting that the trip was taking place, Xinhua's website also didn't carry any news whatsoever either. However, we have to remember this is the longest diplomatic trip undertaken by President Steinmeier since taking office in March of last year, and it follows visits by Chancellor Angela Merkel in May, as well as Foreign Minister Heiko Maas last month. So, Mr. Cui, what is the significance of this trip for President Steinmeier, you think?
Yes, also, comparing with visit by Chancellor Merkel for several times in China, I mean, the visit by President Steinmeier for this time may be a little bit, less visible. But of course, as we know now, today, maybe at this moment, there is another, big moment for German politics. This vote for the new leader for the CDU in Germany. But of course, I think that it is significant, for this visit by President Steinmeier in China. As we know, in recent years, it becomes a kind of a kind of routine, arrangement for China and Germany. We have this state visit by a German president, because as we know, besides this government-to-government cooperation exchange, in the frame of Premier Li and also Prime Minister Chancellor Merkel, and we do have also this kind of state-to-state, society-to-society exchange in the frame of the state visit by President Steinmeier. Indeed, I also know that at this moment, especially for China and Germany, we need to have some more exchange. We need to have some more consensus to deal with some very, very, difficult issue, not only on the regional level and also on global level.
Yeah, for example, protecting multilateralism as well. We may get to that in a second, Mr. Cui. Fraser, over to you. Of course, speaking of high-level exchanges, Sino-German relations have really maintained an extremely high level of momentum this year, with Premier Li and German Chancellor Angela Merkel jointly attending the symposium of the China-Germany Economic Advisory Committee here in Beijing. On May the 24th, there have also been meetings between President Xi and Merkel, of course, last week at the G20 in Argentina. And in July, Premier Li and Chancellor Merkel co-chair the 5th round of intergovernmental consultations in the German capital. So in terms of overall achievements, what can President Steinmeier's visit this time to China actually achieve, you think?
Well, it's simply cementing the already good, solid bilateral relationship between China and Germany. As you say, Germany is the most important trading partner for China. There's ongoing government-to-government consultation, so this is the state-to-state element now being brought into play. So I think it's just really emphasizing the importance that Germany attaches to the relationship with China. The position is, of course, largely ceremonial, but because of his previous experience as a foreign minister, he carries a certain political weight also, President Steinmeier.
All right, and Mr. Cui, how do you think Germany should balance its relationship between China and the United States overall, especially during the Trump administration? How do we make sure the two sides, the relations between Berlin and Beijing are strong and not affected by a third party?
Yes, as we know that both China and the United States are very important, economic and trade partner with Germany. So I think maybe the best choice for Germany is to get the benefits from the cooperation with China and also with the United States. But now, of course, we do need to regard some very big difficulty for the Germany. As we know, still, not only this tariffs issue and also some other trade balance issue between Germany and the United States. But of course, I think that now for Germany, in its interests, certainly it wants to keep a kind of a balance between China and the United States, especially on the trade issue or some other, including the WTO reform, some other related issue. But of course, I hope that yes, how could Germany to deal with this difficult situation, to keep everything under control, but at the same time, I think it's also important for Germany to insist to uphold so-called multilateralism as a principle, as a value. And I think on this regard, Germany at this moment shared a lot, much more than its consensus with the United States.
Yeah, and when it comes to multilateralism, Fraser, over the weekend on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Buenos Aires, President Xi told Chancellor Merkel that China was ready to make joint efforts with Germany to safeguard the multilateral system and an open world economy. Germany, of course, a huge exporter, a very open economy in itself. What particularly do you think Berlin and Beijing might have in mind?
Well, I think firstly they've got to try and work together in the reform of the WTO. The European Union has put proposals on the table, fully supported by Germany as one of the leading members of the EU. China has responded, America not yet. I think we try to build a consensus, firstly to save the dispute settlement mechanism, which is an essential part of the WTO, but secondly also to extend the WTO's competencies and powers into new areas of the economy that simply didn't exist 20 years ago. So if China and Germany can work together on that, I think it will be a huge step forward.
And speaking of working together, perhaps going beyond just a reform of the WTO, how do you think China and Germany can better partner together to address common global challenges? Mr. Cui, perhaps, for example, sustainable development is one area. China has a lot of experience in terms of poverty alleviation. Germany has lots of innovative business models when it comes to engineering, when it comes to technology, especially green technology. So perhaps the two countries not just working on their own bilateral relationship, but helping third-party countries as well to, in terms of promoting their own sustainable development path. What do you think?
Sure. I think it's in the long time, for cooperation. And China and Germany cooperation is regarded as a kind of a complementary cooperation, as we know. And so far, I think that firstly, both sides need to continue this kind of cooperation in a complementary way. For example, in some traditional sectors, including the car making or some other manufacturing. But at the same time, I think secondly, China and Germany, we should be more ambitious to do something more in some new fields of the technology and development, including this auto-piloting automobile and also how it's AI. All of these fields during the visit by Chancellor Merkel last time in China, both sides I think got a lot of consensus. But of course, I think not only, just like you mentioned, on bilateral level, and the China-Germany cooperation should have some more positive spillover effects on a China-EU cooperation. But of course, as we know now, China-Germany, we signed this joint statement on the cooperation in third parties, which means that China and Germany, we should do something more in other parts of the world, including Africa and also Central Asia and some other. So I think not only we need to get a win-win cooperation in trade, in investment, and also we need to try to contribute more to the regional and global peace and prosperity.
Mr. Cui, you mentioned an interesting point in terms of China-German cooperation in terms of artificial intelligence. Fraser, I want to get to you on this because 2018 marks 40 years of science and technology cooperation between China and Germany. There's a very complete systematic framework of science and technology cooperation between the two nations. Where do you see this relationship in particular, this element of the bilateral relationship going on from here? There's also a strategic innovation partnership between the two nations as well.
Sure. I mean, it's going to be, I think, one of the key elements going forward. But having said that, there are some concerns in Germany, as there are in the United States, about China's interference in some areas here. And so there is a certain caution in Germany, which, of course, has led to the screening proposals in the EU now, targeted at foreign investments, also including China in these high-tech sectors. So while on the whole it's going to be a positive area for cooperation, as I say, there are some sensitive issues here which Germany is actually pushing quite hard inside the European Union regarding, protection of intellectual property and how you actually deal with AI going forward, because there are some concerns about how you can misuse the data that's collected.
But when it comes to investments in Germany by China, Mr. Cui, there are currently over 5,000 German firms who have investments here in China. Meanwhile, there are only around 900 Chinese firms in Germany, and also no one, of course, is forcing a German company to be sold by a Chinese buyer in that sense. So what do you make of these concerns? Should these concerns be warranted?
Yes, as we know, recently the Chinese investment in Germany become a very big concern from German side. As I understand that maybe at the first time it's not so familiar, I mean, from a German side to accept a Chinese investment, maybe a very huge increase in a very short time. But of course, another issue is how could China, Germany, we do have some more mutual trust to deal with some issues. I think that yes, Chinese companies or investors, they need to have maybe a better environment for the investment. And of course, that Germany, as one of the more achieving economy in Europe, certainly it attracted a lot of investment from China. But of course, now we need to firstly deal with the issue always in a technical frame. We should not go into maybe a more political or even security issue. Once it happens, I think it will give more complicated environment to this issue, and it will not be helpful for this, I mean, real cooperation in investment between two countries.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. But again, this is the longest state visit by President Steinmeier since taking office over in March of last year. But I guess overall the discussion, the sense that we get is that there is more what unites Germany and China rather than what divides the two nations, and it seems like the mechanisms for dialogue to bridge differences are fully sufficient and there. Many thanks for your insights, both Cui Hongjian, a senior research fellow and director of the Department for European Studies in the China Institute of International Studies, and from Brussels, Fraser Cameron, a senior advisor at the European Policy Center. Thank you to you both. All right, folks, we're going to take a short break right now, but when we return, I'll be asking if the peace talks over in Stockholm aimed at stopping the civil war in Yemen are likely to achieve their goal. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, for the first time in more than 2 years, the Yemeni government and Houthi rebels are holding peace talks aimed at ending the country's devastating civil war. Representatives of both sides came face to face in a castle in Sweden. Yemen has been declared the world's worst humanitarian crisis due to the ongoing famine as well as a terrible cholera outbreak. The United Nations estimates that one child under 5 dies in Yemen every 10 minutes. However, the UN-mediated talks are not expected to produce an immediate breakthrough. To talk more about the ongoing crisis over in Yemen, we are joined in Washington, D.C. by Gerald Feierstein, former U.S. ambassador to Yemen from 2010 to 2013, and in Beirut, we have writer and political analyst Ali Rizk. Thank you, gentlemen, for both joining us here on The Point. Mr. Ambassador, I want to start with you. The UN envoy to Yemen, Martin Griffiths, announced the signing of an agreement on the exchange of prisoners, detainees, and other individuals. Mr. Griffiths sees the talks as an important milestone, but others think there won't be any significant breakthrough. So, realistically, what can the talks achieve, and how do you think it will affect the overall peace process?
Well, I think that it's quite correct to be a little bit cautious about expectations for this round of discussions. These are being billed not as negotiations but as consultations. I think that Martin Griffiths appropriately has established very modest goals for the talks. The prisoner exchange was one of the key achievables that he thought he could get to. He's also looking perhaps for an agreement to reopen the Sana'a airport and possibly some agreement on the way forward for the port of Hodeidah. But this isn't a peace negotiation. The two parties are not meeting face to face, and the delegations really are not at a senior enough level to make those kinds of agreements. I think what we should be hoping for is that this lays a foundation for further talks and perhaps a real negotiation that will end the conflict.
Okay, so perhaps more of a consultation than actual peace talks. Ali, I want to bring you in and get your take on this. What do you think these talks over in Sweden can realistically achieve?
Well, you have to remember that this particular time is quite different than it was recently. You know, Saudi Arabia is increasingly under the spotlight, especially after the killing or the murder of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi. So I think that there is pressure now on the Saudis, in addition to their allies, to make some real concessions when it comes to Yemen. We're hearing also some voices in Congress as well, very strong voices. We have, you know, increasing bipartisan consensus, if you would like, against the Saudi-Emirati war on Yemen. So I believe that all of this put together would have to push the Saudis and the Emiratis, as I said, to make some real concessions. And so this might be a good opportunity for Martin Griffith, with the spotlight, as I said, being on the Saudis, you know, all over the place throughout all world media, European countries, as I mentioned, US Congress. We all hear all of this, you know, negative talk. Saudi Arabia's image is completely tarnished. So bearing that in mind, I think we do have, you know, quite a possibility to achieve something real which wasn't achieved in the previous rounds, like that or those which took place in Kuwait.
Now, Mr. Ambassador, the last attempt at a negotiated peace collapsed back in September when the Houthis failed to show up for talks over in Geneva. What preconditions do you think changed since then for these consultations to actually take place? Do you agree with Ali's assessment that perhaps because Riyadh is now facing more pressure from the death of journalist Jamal Khashoggi?
Well, it is possible that that calculation entered into Saudi thinking about the decision. At least on the surface, the issue seemed to be a demand on the part of the Houthis that they would be allowed to evacuate some of their wounded to another country for medical treatment. It didn't happen in September, and that was their excuse at the time for not turning up in Geneva. This time, the Saudis did permit an evacuation flight. Some 50 Houthi wounded were evacuated to Oman, and therefore the Houthis turned up in Stockholm. Whether or not this really changes Saudi calculations is unclear. And of course, my view has always been that the issue is not a Saudi issue, it is a Yemeni issue, and decisions about how to end this conflict eventually will depend on the willingness of the Yemeni parties to reach an agreement.
All right, and Ali, Iran sought to send a high-level official to Yemen peace consultations, but was rebuffed by President Trump's administration. How does their absence, how does Tehran's absence affect the overall consultations and peace process, you think?
Just before that, if you would allow me just to comment on what was said by the ambassador about, you know, the fact that this is a Yemeni issue. That's true. But in the end, you know, the Saudis and the Emiratis were the ones which launched an aggression. In order to achieve peace, you have to put a stop to this foreign aggression, which has been going on for over 4 years by the Saudis and the Emiratis and some other allies. So it is a Yemeni issue, but Saudi Arabia also dragged themselves and launched this illegitimate war, if you would like. In response to your question about the Iranians and the fact that the Trump administration didn't allow the Iranians to participate, I think what concerns Iran, or Iran's first and foremost focus, is that there won't be an anti-Iranian Yemeni state, meaning that they would like Yemen at least not to be anti-Iranian. That's the only interest, I think, which the Iranians have in Yemen. I think that you know, the American administrations, maybe set all the Obama administration aside, but other administrations don't appear to have learned the lesson that, you know, Iran simply can't be sidelined. They tried to keep Iran out of the process in Syria. We all know how that ended. You know, Iran has now even stronger influence in Syria. And, you know, you can't also deny the fact that Iran does have interests in Yemen. And as I said, that interest is to have a Yemen which is at least not hostile to Iran. But I think at the same time, what we are going to see in Yemen, regardless of what will happen, is we're going to see a Yemen which is hostile to Saudi Arabia first and foremost, and hostile to America as well, because of you know, the American support for this Saudi bombardment of Yemen. So I think the outcome in the end, whatever it may be, will not be a good outcome, whether it be for the Saudis or for the Americans, which continue, you know, to focus on an Iranophobic policy, which to me actually has no clear rationale behind it.
So, Mr. Ambassador, what do we need to see in terms of preventing the greater Middle East region then being engulfed by more instability, with Yemen as sort of being sucked into this flashpoint and being caught in the middle between Riyadh and Tehran?
Well, there is, of course, the larger issue of the tensions between Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states and Iran, the concerns that have been expressed not only by the Trump administration, but by the Obama administration when I was still in government, about Iranian behavior, its intervention in Iran, which triggered the Saudi response. And I think that we need to keep in mind that the aggression in Yemen was not Saudi aggression, it was Houthi aggression against a peaceful political transition that was underway. And the Saudis, seeing legitimately that their security was being threatened by Houthis with encouragement from Iran, reacted. And so I do think that eventually what we're going to have to see is an agreement in Yemen that provides for a secure border between Yemen and Saudi Arabia, the removal of IRGC and Hezbollah operatives from Yemen, and a government in Sana'a that is friendly towards Riyadh. The Saudis have real interests in Yemen. The Iranians do not. And I think that we need to go forward with the understanding that Yemen has to be part of the broader Arabian Peninsula. That's where its interests lie. That's where the Yemeni people have always put their emphasis. And that is the thing that's going to prevent Yemen from becoming an area of permanent conflict like Somalia has been.
Ali, your response to the ambassador, please.
Well, you know, it's actually very, I find that analysis very puzzling. The talk about Iranian intervention, I mean, is it Iran that has launched all of these bombings? Is it Iran which is causing the famine, destroying infrastructure, targeting schools? Even the UN says that 2/3 of the civilian casualties are the result of the bombings launched by Saudi Arabia and its allies. So the Saudi Arabian intervention in Yemen, it's clear to any sane person, it far exceeds any kind of intervention or role which Iran might be playing or which Hezbollah might be playing. And regarding the fact about, Saudi Arabia wanting to have a friendly Yemen, that I think that's completely far-fetched. There's no longer any chance that there'll be a friendly Yemeni government in Saudi Arabia, simply because the Yemeni people, the vast majority of them at least, now view Saudi Arabia as the sworn enemy. You have to remember that Saudi Arabia is the main causer or driver of all of this destruction, in addition to the UAE and the famine and the spread of cholera, etc. That's just not my opinion. Many others, including international organizations, have said the same. So I once again would like to emphasize that whatever be the outcome, there will not be any friendly Yemen to Saudi Arabia, or a friendly Yemen which views Saudi Arabia, as an ally state or anything. And also another factor is, that the fact that Saudi Arabia has interest and the Yemenis wanted to launch aggression. Look, the Houthis, the Yemenis, never launched any attacks across the border into Saudi Arabia until after Saudi Arabia launched its aggression. And I think it's only natural for such parties, or for the Houthis, to have a right to respond in the midst of this crazy bombardment which we've seen, which is unprecedented in decades, by the Saudis and the Emiratis.
Okay, interesting discussion. We're going to have to leave it there. Many thanks for your insights. Both we have, of course, the former ambassador to Yemen from the United States, Mr. Gerald Feierstein. From 2010 to 2013, he was based in Yemen and in Beirut. We have Ali Rizk, a writer and political analyst. Many thanks for your analysis on this topic today here on The Point. And that's going to do it for this edition of The Point. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle ThePointWithLX. You can also download the application called CGTN to watch our shows on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. I'm Michael Wong here in Beijing. We'll see you again soon.